Good morning, I'm Andrew from Transition Towns Kapiti, and I was asked to do a talk on what is Transition Towns. And in the process of getting ready for this talk, I thought, well, how do you do a talk? So you cover the whys, the whats, the whos, the wheres, and so forth. And I was sort of going through the process of setting all that up, and I came up with the various sort of subheadings for each of those. Why are we doing transition towns? It's things like climate change, peak oil, and now more recently the economic collapse. And as I was sort of getting together the ideas, well, how do I tell people about those subjects? I thought, most people have heard of climate change by now. If anybody hasn't heard about the economic problems that we're having in the world, they must be living in a lovely isolated bush setting that doesn't receive any of that sort of information. Peak oil, some people still have not heard of it, some people have. I've sort of been gauging this as we've been talking yesterday. And so I thought I'd quickly cover those basics in today's talk. Cover a little bit about what Transition Towns is and who wants to be involved in Transition Towns. Yeah, is that right enough for you to see there? Okay. And give you a quick map of where Transition Towns is in New Zealand and what's happening with Transition Towns Kapiti. And then I have some very important questions for you to all consider, and for me to consider too. So, what's this talk all about? Peak oil. So, what they've discovered is this is 4 different oil sites in various places around the world, and this is the graph of what the oil comes out of the ground like. When you first start drilling, it comes out slowly and then it climbs to a nice peak, and then if you put those graphs together, accumulate them all the individual wells for an entire region, it sort of averages into a bell-shaped curve. And then what they discover that's the curve for the United States. In 1930s, the discovery of oil in the United States peaked. They found the most oil in the 1930s, and ever since then, despite the new technologies, they've been finding less and less oil. And then you can see the black line shows the consumption of that oil. And about 40 years later, in 1970, America peaked. Now there's a shale oil geologist, Marion King Hubbard, in about the 1950s, predicted this peak. And all the oil geologists said, oh, you're absolutely crazy. He got completely lambasted out of the industry. And yet, in 1970, he was proved right. And ever since 1970, despite, you can see there's a little bump to the right-hand side, that's the discoveries in Alaska. But despite all their discoveries of new technology, they're just getting less and less oil out of the ground. And so America is now importing most of its oil from the Middle East. So this is the same graph for the world. In the grey bars we have discovery, and the world peaked in discovery in the 1960s. And so the red line is us in consumption, and the dotted line is the expected future from here. So we're very close to peak. And in fact, this is off the Oil Drum website, and they estimate that the peak, if you look at just the blue area, that's just straight crude oil. If we're looking at straight crude oil, we peaked in 2005. If you add the Canadian tar sands, we peaked in 2008, and even if you add natural gas on top of that, we still peaked in 2008. Now, that doesn't say that we won't necessarily have another peak if they just have another major discovery, but despite all of their new technologies, amazing three-dimensional graphic tools to image the ground, just about everywhere on the planet has been fully explored. They know where all the oil is, and they've got all the easy stuff out now. All that's left is the hard to get, the stuff in the southern latitudes where it's really stormy and the water's really deep. So peak oil isn't the end of oil, it's the end of cheap oil. It's never going to be cheap again. So, what about climate change? Most of you have all heard about climate change. We know about the glaciers who are in retreat. We know that we're going to have increasing frequency, intensity of storms, and we've all been hearing about the increasing number of floods. Now, most of these things I don't need to go into because I would assume most people have been reading about and hearing about them in newspapers and so forth. So we all know that if we study all the various cycles, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, and then the red line is the observations from the weather station in Hawaii, and we can see that the amount of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is going through the roof. Now there's still political debate about whether this is a problem or not, but 99% of the scientists are all agreeing it's a problem. Just the politicians still want to have an argument about it. And then we have a graph of the temperature past and future for the last 1,000 years. And so up until me see, I don't know, that's about the 19, well anyway, where the yellow line ends, the temperatures have always been, never had a variance of greater than 1. And then you can see at the very end, I need one of those little laser light pointers, because I can point to it here, but you can't see what I'm pointing at. But there's a big arrow that's showing where we're at today, and it's way above any temperature anomaly we've had in the last 1,000 years. And then to the right of that is the predictions of where it will go from here. Economic collapse. Who hasn't heard about the GDP going down through the floor? And we have had articles in papers, much discussion, heard about what the United States government is doing. Basically, it's a big black hole in which they're pouring trillions of dollars. Now there's a great little presentation out there called The Crash Course, which you can see at chrismartinson.com, and he does a really good little presentation about understanding what a trillion is. Because you just say, oh yeah, it's a few $1 trillion. It's a really, really big number. And I won't go into it because we've got a fairly short talk today, but the information about the economy is not good, and there's millions of papers and so forth talking about it. So, all of those things are the reasons of why we want to be doing transition towns. So, what is a transition towns? Well, I've been to a couple of different stalls doing presentations about transition towns, and people come ask what's a transition towns, and I fumble over the words and da-da-da-da-da. But after a whole weekend of it last year, I came up with this slogan. A transition town is a town transitioning itself from a fossil fuel dependency to a more sustainable way of life. Cha-choo, boom, how's that? And there are other descriptions, but I think that really encapsulates it. It's looking at how to be more sustainable in your own town and not depend on outside energy sources of fossil fuel, etc. And who's involved in transition towns? It's a group of local citizens concerned with making ourselves have a more sustainable future by reducing our fossil fuel dependency. And anyone is welcome to join and become part of Transition Towns Kapiti, and I'd be delighted if you were all to, at the end of this talk, be so inspired that you want to join. A little bit of the history of transition towns. A permaculture teacher, Rob Hopkins, in 2004 or 2005-ish, showed a documentary about peak oil to his permaculture students in a little town called Kinsale in Ireland, and they were, as a collection of young students, really shocked at what could happen to their town in Kinsale, because they realised in Kinsale in Ireland they're at the long end of a pipeline from the North Sea with a lot of other customers in between who might at any time like to say, I'm sorry, we're going to turn the tap off, we need the gas, we need that oil, Ireland can just miss out. And Ireland has a fantastic history of getting lots of supply and support from the UK. We all know about those histories. And they developed an energy descent plan, and that was adopted by the Kinsale Council completely as it was, unabridged, as a way forward for Kinsale. So they're looking at doing things like market gardens. They have a food forest, and they had a nutty Sunday where they went out and planted a huge number of nut trees. And Rob Hopkins, then for personal reasons of his own, has moved to another town called Totnes, where he sort of repeated the exercise of introducing peak oil and climate change problems and the idea of transitioning the town to the people in Totnes. And Totnes became sort of the official first transition towns. It's like, I don't know, Kinsale was a dry run, although Kinsale is now officially a transition town, and they're going forward. So here in New Zealand, transition towns sort of was starting in the Hawke's Bay, sort of, and a couple of other places. But a peak oil education person came to the Eco Show in 2007 and introduced towns to New Zealand. And we now have over 50 towns in New Zealand who are looking at the transition towns model. That might be a town where somebody's just stood up and said, look, I want to make our town a transition town, so I'm just going to start having regular meetings. Right through to some transition towns who've got environmental centres involved, they've got a huge group of people, or like here on the Kapiti Coast, we've been running for 12 months and we've been showing a documentary every month for the last 12 months. And worldwide, there's over 600 towns who are in that boat of what do we need to do to transition ourselves. So it's a grassroots movement and it's growing. So then I wanted to quickly cover, and I know I'm going very fast, but they only gave me 35 minutes. In 35 minutes I need to give you the solution to the world's problems. Good man. So, what's happening?